You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the new edition of MCC Podcasts. My name is Attila Norbert Ferencz, and I'm a student of MCC School of International Relations, and I'm also the host for today's podcast. My distinguished guest today is Professor Andreas Kinneging from the University of Leiden. He's a Dutchman, an expert and professor in legal history and philosophy, and also the author of many books. He's a well-known conservative thinker in his country, and Professor, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Today's topic will mostly be classical liberalism, but we will also touch upon some other very interesting topics as well. And as far as I know, you were actively involved in politics in the Netherlands. Can you tell me something about this period and about why did you quit politics?
Oh, yes, I can. It's a long time ago in a sense that I was directly active in Dutch politics. This was in the 80s. I was on the staff of a think tank connected to the Dutch Classical Liberal Party, the VVD, where I immediately out of university, I gave lectures and seminars and also wrote a couple of books, mainly at the time. First about economic theory and economic policy, and then about the philosophy of liberalism. But this was, as I said, in the 80s, and after about 3 or 4 years, I moved on first to the Ministry of Finance for a short stay, and after that I returned to the university to write a PhD at the University of Leiden, and then I never managed to leave Leiden again, so I'm still there.
Well, one of your students in Leiden was Ayaan Hirsi Ali. What happened back in 2004 and how it affected the situation of liberalism in the Netherlands?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali came from, I think, Somalia or Sudan, I forgot.
She was a refugee, basically.
Yes. And still very young. She went to she finished high school, and then she went to the university, and she ended up at the University of Leiden, where, she was mainly taught by one of my direct colleagues, Paul Cliteur. And after that, she went into politics, first a short while for the Socialist Party, but very quickly she changed to the Classical Liberal Party I spoke about to you before, the VVD. And, being an intelligent and nice lady, she quickly acquired a seat in the Dutch parliament. So, as a 30-something, she became one of the most prominent politicians in the Netherlands, in the country. But given the fact that she acquired this prominence, particularly because of her anti-Islam or anti-political Islam stance, she was endangered, and she had to be protected by the police. And now that, after a while, became a problem. And I think that is the main reason, to cut a long story short, that eventually she left the Netherlands and went to the United States.
Yes, and now she lives there, if I'm not mistaken.
She lived in the United States, I think, for about 20 years. And I just last week or the week before, I learned that she and her husband moved to Britain.
Yes, and her husband is Niall Ferguson, the famous historian, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you're correct. Yes.
Well, she was involved in some of Theo van Gogh's work on a film, and after the assassination of Van Gogh, she moved abroad. You basically told.
Yeah, it's a bit more complex in the details, but this is sort of the basic bottom line of the story.
And
that's true. So Theo van Gogh was murdered by a Muslim activist, and who is still in jail for that murder. And she decided to move to the US because for her at the time it was a much safer place to be.
Well, did you change your opinion about the role of the state after the assassination we've mentioned, and how did it affect your view on political science or political philosophy?
The whole issue of clashing civilizations, which is the issue here, right? The clash, so to speak, between fundamentalist Islam and the contemporary liberal or ultra-liberal West. That is a problem which is probably too big a problem for politicians to be able to solve it. And perhaps there is no, there's no human solution to that other than either we leave each other alone in our own sphere, or we wage total war with each other. And it seems to me that the wisest solution, the way to move forward, is to leave each other alone. Now, as soon as you do not do that, you get into very, very, very hairy problems. And the state, it's the duty of the state, of course, to protect intellectuals, public intellectuals, people who have a clear opinion about things and have arguments about things. If they are threatened, the state has to protect them. But we have to understand that this protection can never be, fully guaranteed. And it seems to me that is the human condition. And everyone has to be aware of that, including the public intellectual, him or herself. What I'm saying is that speech and free speech is extremely important, but as an individual, you have to understand that we live in a dangerous world sometimes, and saying some things comes with a cost. And, you can say it's a pity, and everyone should be able to say whatever he or she likes, and on principle, I agree with that, but in practice, there are difficulties resulting from such a position that will never go away, whether you wish for that or not.
You've mentioned that we live in a dangerous world, and And you are also known to be a critic of modernization. And what makes you think that that ancient and medieval values are still relevant even in today's circumstances? You wrote several books on these topics.
Yes, I did. The short answer is that I think that modernity is a wrong turn, and is in the long run is not a stable solution. And that means that if we want stable solution to human problems, we need to return to the ancients and the medievals. My adagium would be, the way forward is the way back. So why am I saying that modernity is not a viable state? Let me first quickly expound on what modernity is, in my opinion. Modernity is the result, so modernity, modern society as it exists nowadays, is the result, it seems to me, of two intellectual innovations, so to speak. First of all, the Enlightenment. The most important Enlightenment thinkers are Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, and Baruch de Spinoza. What are these people famous for? They are famous for essentially saying that the world is nothing more than a constellation of matter, which is causally determined. And they say this on the basis of the so-called scientific revolution, modern scientific revolution, which was affected by the Copernicus and Galilei and later Newton. Now, if you argue that the world is little more than the matter in movement, the whole sphere of the mind, of the spirit, becomes questionable, to say the least. From this view developed very early, for instance, the denial of the existence of God. So in other words, atheism of some kind or another, openly or more disguised. Now, if there's no God, if there's no divine ground of being, so morality, good and evil, also become questionable. Like if the world exists of matter in motion and nothing more, where do we find good and evil? There's no corner in the world where you find it.
Just a side note for the listeners, you wrote a book titled Geography of Good and Evil.
Yes, yeah. And the title the title is sort of a riddle that has to be solved. The geography of good and evil. Well, if you practice geography, you want to understand the world and the places that are in the world, that are there. You want to discover them, right? Now, what I'm saying is that there is a geography of good and evil. So good and evil is not something subjective and therefore something relative, something we invent and put forward. No, good and evil is also something you find in the world, like you find a tree in the world, or a country in the world, or a language in the world, or people in the world. So good and evil is something there is. Now, you can only say that if you say that the world is more than matter in motion. Now, who said that the world is more than matter in motion? Well, the medievals and the ancients. You see? Now this is a very short summary of this, of my take on this topic. If we were to talk much longer on it, I would also have to include another type of modernity, another side of modernity, and that's the side that does not derive from the Enlightenment, but it's a side that derives from something that is as modern as the Enlightenment, but a kind of counter-Enlightenment, and that's Romanticism. And, very quickly, in a few sentences, what's the essence of Romanticism? The essence of Romanticism is that the most important thing in life is authenticity, is being yourself. And so it's no longer serving God, or as the Christians would say, the medievals would say, or serving the good, as the ancients would say. No, it's being yourself. And if you like, developing yourself, and also connected to it, finding yourself. And this is interpreted, again, on two levels. On the individualistic level. So then finding yourself would mean finding out who you as an individual truly are. But there's also a collectivistic Romanticism, in which finding yourself or being yourself would apply to a nation. As when one would say, like, we Hungarians, we have to be ourselves, and we have to stay ourselves, and we have to stay authentic, or we Germans have to stay authentic, or we Dutch, or whatever. You see?
So it's derived basically from the Enlightenment, but it's not like...
No, it's not derived from the Enlightenment. It's sort of a counter-Enlightenment.
I see.
Because the Enlightenment leads to something else. Namely, if you think that everything that exists is matter in motion, including human beings, then what drives human beings is merely physical impulses, or impulses that are ultimately physical. And then, if you say that, the conclusion is that the highest purpose in life, if you even want to speak of a purpose, perhaps a better expression would be the highest drive in life, the highest causal drive in life, is the satisfaction of your material impulses. And that leads to fixation on consumption and production. That is to say, on the market economy, and on having as high an income as possible, and on consumption as the purpose of life, etc., etc. Now, the Romantics. Romanticism is an opposition exactly to all these ideas. To the conception of the world and humans as matter in motion. Romantics will say, no, humans are much more than matter in motion. And life signifies much more than just the satisfaction of material impulses. A life is much more. It's much deeper than just consumption and production. So that's romantic, and you recognize that because it's very, very strong all over the West. So you have this struggle between Romanticism and the Enlightenment, and that constitutes modernity. Now, my take on this is that both the Enlightenment and Romanticism are a wrong turn. Yeah, so I am against the view of the world and humans as matter emotion. But I am also against the romantic idea that the most important thing in life is to find and to be and to develop yourself, your deeper self. Whether interpreted as something individual or interpreted as something collective. Right? Because I think that both approaches, both modern approaches, leave out the most important thing.
And what is this most important thing?
Well, the most important thing is the spiritual side of life, which is grounded in, some call it the world spirit, and some others call it the divine ground of being. Something which has created the world, the material world, but also the immaterial world, so good and evil, so to speak, and which sets certain goals for us. So we have to pursue the good and to avoid the evil. And expressed in a Christian way, so we have to obey the Ten Commandments. So what do you have to do in life? You have to obey the Ten Commandments. And do you have to be yourself or develop yourself or something like that? No, you have to try to be a good human being and try to be not an evil human being. So that's a totally different view of life. Totally different view of the purpose of life.
Yes, indeed. And returning to the classical liberalism, could you present briefly its worldview and standpoint, just like you did with modernization and romanticism?
Classical liberalism is the main expression of Enlightenment thought. If you say that the world is matter in motion, human beings are also matter in motion, and causally determined. Now, what our strivings are therefore determined by material causal factors. Now, which are these causal factors? Impulses. In other words, certain desires that are ultimately material. So what do we do in life? Nothing else than satisfying these material impulses, these desires, and avoiding as much as possible the things that run counter to these material desires. Now, if we now look at classical liberalism, and say classical liberalism is primarily an economic way of thinking. So it's economic liberalism. Now, who's the father of economic liberalism? Adam Smith, especially the Adam Smith of the 1776 book, Inquiring into the Causes and the Nature of the Wealth of Nations. Now, so what view of man is propounded in the Wealth of Nations? Well, the view of man as a utility maximizer. And what view? So, what is a utility maximizer? Utility maximizer is precisely the human being I described a minute ago. So, the human being who is after satisfying his physical impulses. And again, so what's the purpose of life, according to Adam Smith? Well, the maximization of consumption. And for the maximization of consumption, you need the most effective and efficient organization of production. So you see, classical liberalism, at least in its original form, is a child of the Enlightenment. in the form Adam Smith and his followers gave to it. Then in the 19th century, you see a new development in classical liberalism, and the main author, I think, is John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill wrote several books, but his most important book, in my opinion, is On Liberty. What does he say in On Liberty? Essentially, that life is more than consumption and production, and that human beings are more than satisfiers of their desires. No, the most important thing about human beings is their, and that's his word, individuality. You can also say their unicity or their authenticity, or in other words, their self, their being themselves. And there you see that Mill imported the basic ideas of Romanticism, which began, of course, with Rousseau, and then became very strong in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. Mill imported these ideas into political philosophy and into the Anglo-Saxon world and made them very influential, very famous.
Well, you've partially answered my next question about what has changed in liberalism over time.
Yes.
Why and how has it evolved over centuries?
But let me, if I may.
Okay.
Let me contrast Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, and let's take a look at the two opposing views of the state, which are a consequence of the different anthropologies, different view of man. Now, if you say, well, human beings want to satisfy their desires, and the best way to do that is to have a market society. It is evident that you will be in favor of a minimal state. And that's precisely what we see in Adam Smith and his followers. So what's the task of the state? The state is supposed to guard the peace between the various individuals, especially by maintaining the criminal law, so that there is no murder and no theft and no fraud, etc., etc. And it is supposed to sort of help establish the market by a good codex, a book of civil law, because the property and contract have to be defined. Property and contract as the central presuppositions of a functioning market. So this is essentially what the state has to do, right? And then of course you have foreign enemies, and so you have to have an army, and you have to have an army. Then you have the criminal law, including those who warrant the criminal law, namely the police and the judges and jails, etc., etc. And you have the civil law, the system of civil law. And that's it. That's all there is. Now, if you then move on from Smith to Mill, and you say, well, it's not so much that human beings are utility maximizers. No, they have individuality, and this individuality is in fact the highest thing they have, and therefore it has to be protected. It's not just their property that has to be protected, or contracts, or their physical body, as the classical liberals would say. No, it is their individuality that has to be protected. And who is going to protect it? Well, of course, the state is going to protect it. This is a new task of the state. Now, how are you going to protect and even further human individuality? Well, for instance, you need an elaborate system of education, schools and so on and so forth. So you have a new task. And then, and this is, I think, one of Mill's main points. If individuality is really so important, the relationship between the individual and society becomes a relationship with much more tension than when you say, well, you know, life is all about satisfying the desires. Because if the latter is the case, and you're in a social situation where you cannot find your desires, well, then you can move, you can go away, you can look up other people and try and see how you can satisfy your desires. So society is not generally conceived as something very problematic or even tyrannical. Now, if you move on from this position to Mill's position, you see that, especially on liberty, Mill singles out society as the most important potential tyrant, because it's not the state who's going to limit your individuality. No, it's the other persons in the room. It's society. It's the community that limits your individuality, that limits your possibility of being yourself, making certain social norms obligatory, of forcing you to conform yourself to the social norms, social values. So here you see that very naturally, from this anthropology of individuals as unique self-developers, comes a view that says, results a view that says, well, the state has to be helped by the individual to be itself. It has to be helped against society. So there is an inimical relationship between the individual and society. And the state has to help the individual versus the society to be itself. Now, let me give you, to conclude, one very concrete example. One form of society or community, if you want, is the family. Right? Now, if the individual is limited in its individuality by the family, and individuality is the highest command, and the state is the one that has to support individuality, the state therefore has to support the individual against the family.
That's very interesting.
Yes, which means, for instance, if the family were to be a Christian family, to give you just one example, and it were to say, well, Christianity is the truth, and we are going to raise you as a Christian child, then one could argue, and this is being done at the moment more and more, that the family doesn't leave the individual, to be itself and to develop its own self, its own personal views. And this is a kind of indoctrination of the specific community, namely the family, of the individual. Hence, it is not allowed, and the state has to forbid it. And if the family goes on influencing the individual, then the state has to act and has to punish the family, or perhaps take the child away from the family. Now, this is a very interesting example, which is, which is very relevant for the political and the social discussion at the moment.
Well, the example you mentioned can be perceived by one that it's a disadvantage of classical liberalism. But I'm very curious about your opinion about, and if you had to name the biggest advantages of liberalism or classical liberalism, what would they be?
Well, the market. I think, let me give you a little bit of a historical overview. For as long as human beings have walked around on the earth, society has been principally and first of all, community. So the concept of community is important. What is a community? Well, you have three types of community. First of all, you have so-called blood communities, communities of the blood. Again, principally the family, your blood relatives. And then, of course, the people in your village, often related by blood. And then perhaps your fellow Hungarians. And then, so this is the first type of community. Then the second type of community is the religious community. So think of Islam, or think of Calvinism, or Catholicism, or whatever. So these are very different type of community, but there are also communities in which people have the feeling that they belong together for a different reason, but it's the same feeling of belongingness, of belonging together. And then the third type of community is the community based on friendship, as you would see, for instance, in for instance a football club, or a chess club, and perhaps you could also see to some extent a nation, not as a blood community, but as a friendship community. Anyway, so community in all of its forms has always been the backbone of every society. Now, this has changed fundamentally in recent, let's say, in the past 100 years. What happened? What happened is this: that two other institutions, namely the state and the market, which both have existed for a long, long time, for thousands of years, but existed as supplementary systems to the community. Yeah. So for instance, in a community like a village, you would have a market once a week. Yeah, because people need all kinds of stuff, and they cannot provide themselves for the stuff only through the community. Therefore, you also need a bit of market. And in the same way, the state has always been a supplementary organization. Most problems were dealt with within the community. But some situations, some people, some problems were so problematic that it could no longer be solved by the community, and then the state, the special organization, the organization of violence, mind you. State is the organization of violence. It's the weaponized organization. It's the organization with prisons and with policemen and soldiers with guns. It's the organization which kills or can kill. Now, so for these the huge problems which the community could not solve, for instance, the attack of a foreign enemy, the state developed. It's about, let's say, 5,000 years ago. So now, if we go from 5,000 years ago to, let's say, 100 years ago, lots of things change, of course, but not the fundamental makeup of society as consisting of communities with, on the side, two supplementary institutions, namely the market and the state. So the community was first and the biggest and the most important in human life. And still in some far-off villages in the Carpathian Mountains or in the Tatra Mountains or whatever, it's still the community, or in the Atlas Mountains or in the Alps. It's still the community that determines most of what happens in an individual's life, in a human's life. But in general, the picture has changed fundamentally in the past 100 years, and especially after World War II. So what do we see in the past decades? That to a very large extent, the community has been abolished, eaten up by the state on the one hand, that has grown and grown and grown and taken over most of the tasks that belonged to the community in the past. And on the other hand, by the market, which also has taken over many of the tasks that belong to the community. So you get an etatification, statification, and you get a marketification. And the community becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and is more and more and more degenerates more and more and more and it becomes ever smaller and weaker and less important in a human's life. Now that is, that is the historical backbone. That is the historical context. Now, as you in this country have experience with, communism, of course, abolished the community and it abolished the market. So all that remains is this totalitarian state. Now, we have learned, to the extent that we didn't know from theory, we have learned, that from the experience of Eastern Europe, that this is not a good idea. And we should never do it again. So socialism, or if you want communism and socialism are simply a false idea. They seem to be a good idea, but they are not good ideas. Now, what about economic liberalism? What about classical liberalism of the Adam Smith variety, or if you like, the Mises and Hayek variety, who are contemporary followers of Adam Smith, who would say, well, the best society is a market society in which everything is governed by the market. Now, it seems to me that this is a mistake. It's not as bad a mistake as the mistakes the communists/socialists make, but it's also a mistake, and it's not a small mistake. So I would say, yes, we need a market. Yes, and we have to let the market function. Just like we need a state, and we have to let the state function. But neither of them should dominate society, should become the most important social principle for ordering society. Because in a good society, the most important social principle is neither market nor state, but community. In the three different varieties of the communities we have.
Well, before turning to Hungary, at this point of our conversation, I would mention woke. And my question is that what is the relationship between wokeism and liberalism? Or are there even any similarities?
Yes, wokeism, strange as it may sound, is both a child of communism and a child of liberalism, of the million versions, the romantic liberalism. Let me explain this. If you say, as is now done very often, that you are an opponent of racism, you are an opponent of inequality, you are an opponent of sexism, You're an opponent of inequality, equality between the sexes, and so on. Xenophobia, it's the equality between citizens and non-citizens. Homophobia, equality between homosexuals and heterosexuals. Transphobia. And all these discussions are about, in a sense, about equality. So what you are factually saying is that or propounding or proposing is an egalitarian theory. So you think the highest value there is equality. And there are to be no differences between people. There cannot be any different treatment of people. Now that is strongly reminiscent of communism, because communism's highest value was precisely equality. You see? But in a sense, you could say wokeism is more radical than the old communism, because the old communism was only interested in social economic equality, whereas the new communism, wokeism, is interested in equality in all respects. All respects. So sexual equality, gender equality as it is called today, racial equality, political equality, economic equality, on every level, any form of inequality is taboo. Now, that might sound very humanistic, but we know from the example of the old communist system that if you really want to enforce it, you will end up with a totalitarian state. And that is what we have to avoid at all costs. And therefore we have to accept and even embrace many kinds of inequality. To return to my former point about the community, a community is a community of human beings who want to be together. Which means that there are always human beings who cannot be part of the community. They are excluded from the community. To give you an example, a family wants to be together. Parents want to take care of their own children. They do not want to take care, other than incidentally, of the children of the neighbors. You see? So a community is exclusive, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like, by the way, for the critics of community, just like the market is exclusive or excluding anyone who cannot pay, right? And just like the state is exclusive or excluding. We have to accept that it's just like what we talked about at the beginning of the interview when we spoke about the safety of public intellectuals. We have to accept that complete or total inclusion is something that is impossible in this world. Yeah, we are all at certain points in our life excluded from whatever. So this is the relation between woke and communism. There is also a relation between there's also a relation between woke and liberalism, as I said. Now let me explain that. The highest value of liberalism is liberty. Now, in classical liberalism, this liberty is defined quite modestly as liberalism from mainly state intervention. The state has to withdraw, become a minimal state, so that I can do whatever I like on my own, but especially with others, via contracts. So on the market, we can trade, we can produce, we can sell, we can buy, etc., etc. Now, in the 19th century, as I told you, starting with John Stuart Mill, this concept of liberty is broadened. It is no longer a concept that is defined in opposition to state intervention. It is now defined in opposition to social intervention. Intervention by others, intervention by the community. You remember that I spoke about the family and the individual, and the idea that the family should not limit the individual in its individuality. You see? So if you say, well, liberty is not only threatened by the state, but it's also threatened by society, yeah, well, then who is the big defender of liberty? The state. The state. So the state comes in as the defender of liberty. And now you move one step further. And you will say, well, liberty is not only the liberty vis-à-vis the state or vis-à-vis other people, that is to say the community or society. It's also, for instance, liberty vis-à-vis my own body. So, I look in the mirror, I see a man, and that limits me, that limits my liberty. You see? And as a free person, I should be able to determine myself, I myself should be able to determine what is my gender. I may be a man biologically, sexually, and this is a fact. But this fact is not just a fact, it's something that limits me, it limits my liberty. And so thank God that I can choose my gender, because this is a new, an ultimate form of liberty.
So there is a string between liberalism and wokeism.
Absolutely, just like there is a connection between liberalism and communism.
It's a very fair point. Let's end our conversation with a look into the future. And what direction do you expect trends of liberalism to bring about in the next years?
Well, there's a difference between expectation and hope, right?
Yes.
I think we need the voice of classical liberals, because the function and the value and the importance of the market, of the free market, tends to be forgotten all of the time and everywhere. I see this also with my students and also with my colleagues, most of whom have no inkling, no idea of how the market works and how important it is. And I think that that's very dangerous. At the same time, I think that classical liberalism tends to become fundamentalist classical liberalism and tends to believe that the market is everything there is. And that seems to me to be a mistake. I explained this before. Now, I hope, I'm not saying I expect, but I hope that the classical liberals of the right kind can be influential also in the future. What about the other liberals, the million liberals? Well, I think they are a big problem, as romanticism in general is a big problem. And I've been doing my best for a long time, and I will do my best as long as I live, to fight against this idea, this notion of being yourself, of authenticity as the highest purpose in life. Now, what do I expect? I expect that I'm not going to be very successful, and I expect that romantic views, including romantic liberal views, are going to be very successful for the next, at least several decades.
Yes, thank you very much. This episode of the MCC Podcasts ends here. Professor Andreas Kinneging, thank you very much for being here, for accepting my invitation, and thank you for this very enlightening conversation. And to those who listen to this podcast, thank you for tuning in, and we hope to meet you again in one of our next episodes. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this MCC Podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.